name's Andrew. I am a workaholic. And just thought I would start off with kind of what I see workaholism as being, because obviously it's something that can very easily get misunderstood just there's a lot of people that don't even believe there is such a thing, or you might tell them, I know somebody who's told a lot of people about workaholism and Workaholics Anonymous and gotten this blank look, or oh, that's nice, or ha ha ha, don't be silly. How could anybody be addicted to work? And I've certainly had lots of misunderstandings over. I've been in WA for 4 years, or maybe a little more. And the other interesting thing is I think it's a multifaceted thing. Which is not different really when you think about, take alcoholism. I come in because to AA, that is because I have an alcohol problem, right? I have a drinking problem, and alcohol is killing me or ruining my life, or in general, I think I have a problem with alcohol. But then you work me through these steps, the vast majority of which don't mention alcohol at all. They have all to do with God and interacting with other people and, resentment and fear and all of these things that can be very easy to think have nothing to do with alcohol. Like, what does this have to do with my problem? I need to get sober. And a lot of times when we first come into a program, when we say that, we mean dry. And then we find out that there's so much more, that sobriety is not recovery. There's more to things, and that my real problem might be something much deeper. So in the big book it says, we've stopped fighting anyone or anything. We muster. It kills us. After all, bottles were only a symbol. So that begs the question, what's behind the symbol? Earlier on in the same book it says, this guy takes the example of a guy that was told he was probably going to die of alcoholism, and that his best bet, if he wanted to live, was to hire a bodyguard. And I'm not sure what the bodyguard was going to do, protect him from people who were going to beat him up, or pour out his drinks as he was ordering them. But anyways, it said he was going to need to either go to an institution or get somebody watching him 24/7. And it says he may now go anywhere on earth that other free men may go, provided he maintains a certain simple attitude, which has always made me very, very curious what that attitude is. And notice it doesn't say anything about the booze. It doesn't get down to brass tacks and talk about how's this guy going to not drink, because later on it says, there's lots of people who sent their spouses to very remote places trying for a geographic cure, only to find it go haywire. And it said, you could send an alcoholic to the Greenland ice cap, and an Eskimo would turn up with a bottle of scotch and ruin everything. So the details of how we stop, which is particularly relevant to workaholics, because what I've noticed, it doesn't look to me like the number of hours somebody works is anything like a good basis for that person or anyone else to characterize them as a workaholic. That certainly might correlate, but that correlation is not causation. That I know workaholics who work 40 hours a week. I know workaholics who work 15 and less. I know workaholics who work 60 and more. I know, it's all across the board. And again, there might be a strong correlation, but that's not how I know that I'm a workaholic. So, yeah, I'll get into my story, because I had times I didn't think I was a workaholic before and during program. I had times I thought I was a mild workaholic before and during program. I had, the whole gamut. And yet, it seems important to talk about what it is and, the fundamentals, what's behind the curtain, so to speak, before talking about the details of my story. Because what I've noticed also is I can share my story and people kind of like do this checking off. Okay, I did that. Oh, that sounds like me. Well, that doesn't sound anything like me. Oh, I never did that. And there's all kinds of stuff in my story that can go one of two ways. One way is this guy really a workaholic? I mean, is this a real thing? This guy is talking about this kind of silly, trivial stuff and telling me that it's workaholism, which I'm not sure if I believe it, or I'm not sure I believe he is one, because, maybe my story sounds tame, especially compared to what people might expect a workaholic to look like. Or another direction is, oh, well, I never did anything like that, and so this isn't relevant to me. I'm not a workaholic. And incidentally, I'm not here to tell anybody that they're a workaholic or aren't one. Because think about it, I don't have any dog in that fight. What do I care if somebody else is or not? I spent a long time trying to diagnose people at my job, and it's just ridiculous. Like, what would it even matter anyways? It might change a little bit how I interact with them, but and maybe I would try to carry the message to them, but probably not. So anyway, what is workaholism, at least as I see it? So one of the things I think is essential is my self-worth feeling tied up with my work and how others see me. Now, with the how others see me, that's kind of getting into, I call it anonism. I have an anon program that I work, none too diligently, but that codependent, like for Codependents Anonymous or anyone who's a co-addict or affected by addicts, that's a typical characteristic. But I think that has a lot of, for me it's Al-Anon. I get that kind of recovery from Al-Anon. And I see a ton of overlap between the two, because what is an Al-Anon? A lot of Al-Anons have noticed in themselves a tendency to say yes to a lot of things, right? A lot of things that later I start thinking I shouldn't have said yes to that. And what does a workaholic do? Says yes to a lot of things, including a lot of things that later I think to myself, oh, I shouldn't have said yes to that. There's just a lot of Al-Anons work very hard. So you can see there's plenty of overlap. But coming to the part that's more specific to workaholism is that my self-worth gets tied up with my work and the results of my work, how much I work and what I accomplish, and the prestige I get from my work, the pride that I take in my work. And then of course the other side of the coin, just like the AA 12 and 12 talks about, is fear. Fear that I won't get something I want, fear that I'll lose something that I have, fear that something will go terrible at my job. In particular, fear that if I'm not there, something terrible will happen. If I'm not working really, really hard, something terrible will happen. It's funny, so I work more or less out of the big book of AA with my WA program. I also really, really like the WA literature. It's sort of half and half for me, as AA literature certainly informs a lot of it. And one thing that it does is my 4-step inventory process in WA, which is interesting in that all of my 4-step fear inventories in WA, every single one of them has been of the form, I'm scared that I'm going to lose my job and therefore lose my house. Every single one of them. Obviously not 100%, but it's just amazing how many times in a month I can have that thought and that fear, which I really feel like fear is another thing that's essential to workaholism. Fear is really a driver. It's really one way that I know what workaholism is that workaholism has a lot to do with fear of insecurity, material insecurity in particular, to a certain extent, as we talked about before, emotional insecurity around other people. And then lastly, I tend to think of my workaholism as being a pressure-based issue, that I'm pressuring myself, and that is one of the keys to my workaholism. In general, when I find myself pressuring myself about anything, whether it's a tiny task or a huge project or just getting somewhere on time or oh Lord, pressuring myself to be a really great dad, that counts as workaholism, and it's a very clear warning symbol and marker to me. And that's what all of these are, incidentally. Of anything that I say about what I think workaholism is, or any thing from my story, it's all just indicators. It's all just, when you add this up, in general, it definitely looks like a case of workaholism. You know, there's evidence for it that um, it's just like when if you do the 20 question quiz about workaholism, and you check a certain number of those as yes, I did that or felt that way. All that does is give you clues. All that is indicator. So that's back to that idea that there's no way to say for sure, certainly not for me to say, that so-and-so is a workaholic. But I definitely know it for myself, and hopefully we'll see that as I share my story. But there is a basis for the idea of workaholism in the big book, and I may not get the quotes exactly right, but in the chapter to employers, it talks about alcoholics are energetic people, and once he gets sober, you may have to curb his enthusiasm, your employee's enthusiasm, that is, to work. I forget if it says 12-hour days or 16-hour days. Incidentally, just a tiny little tangent there. I hear a lot of people talking about their 16-hour day, and that isn't that a real little warning bells go off in my head, and little red flags get thrown about what a workaholic thing that is to say. In particular, not because I believe the person actually worked 16 hours. Again, I don't see hours worked as a particularly useful way to mark this sort of thing. To say the hours worked are what really informs me about workaholism. I don't think so. I think when somebody tells me they worked a 16-hour day, or I think what does that translate to? If you worked 5 16-hour days, that's an 80-hour week. And I've heard people talk to me about 100-hour weeks, people who are billed a lot of money by the hour, and I don't believe it for a second. I mean, think about it. There's 178 hours in a week, and this guy says he worked 100 of them. It's, that's ridiculous. That's insanity. It's insane to believe that that was true, much less that it's possible. Um, there's just no such thing. I mean, is that person billing the time he ate lunch? Even if it was 15 minutes, like a 15-minute breakfast, a 15-minute lunch, and a 15-minute dinner. Is he billing that time? Because that's about the only way, is he billing some of his sleep time? Did he take naps at the office and bill that? I just don't see that as a real thing that could possibly be true. And that's part of it, is that a workaholic would probably have a tendency, I know that I do as a workaholic, have a tendency to overinflate what I say to others, whether in a business context or not, about how much I worked and how much I accomplished. Oh, so back to the big book basis, you may have to curb his enthusiasm and work 12-hour days. Let's call it 12 hours. And it talks about, in a number of places, I believe, this impulse that a sober alcoholic might have to fill up a lot of time with work, in particular for the goal of undoing the financial ruin that he or she might have gotten themselves into from alcoholism. And it talks quite a bit about this idea of working half pace, at this slothful way, which is not necessarily directly related to the alcohol. That is just, I'm not very inspired in my job. This is something that a lot of people feel, in particular addicts. We have this sense of entitlement and want our job to challenge us, and we might have been taught that sort of idea. Looking to an external situation to meet my needs and meet them the way I want, when I want. You see what I mean? Instead of me challenging myself, instead of me giving of myself to my job, it's oh, well, I'm just not very inspired in my job, and so I'm not going to work very hard. I mean, Lord knows I have a lot of that in my history, and even now, it's something to always be looking at. So I came in particularly concerned about my tendency to underwork, and I wasn't sure if WA was going to work for me, no pun intended, that, um, I saw all these people working so many hours, and it was true when I joined that I was working a lot of hours. I was in a graduate program that, um, I call it work because it really was much more like a job than like school, the way I understood it, and I still see it as a basically a precursor to the job I have now. Uh, Really, any way you slice it, a it was a lot like an unpaid internship. It's very clearly part of my career and my work history. And so it so happened that I was working many hours at that time, but I was also using video games in a kind of drug-like way, and I still struggle with that, and I'll get to that in a while. That's one way that I can track my addiction is an addiction to underwork, to getting out of stuff, and I was taught from my very very first meeting that overworking and underworking are two sides of the same coin. That the reason I and others underwork is because we're burnt out from either actual overwork or our ideas about work, our workaholic thinking about what it means to work. Because the classic example, one time I had a sponsee, his car was a messy Suburban that was full about a foot down from the ceiling from the roof with stuff. And I said, "Oh, you must be a perfectionist." And he said, "What are you talking about, Andrew? You're looking at my car, right? How can you call this perfectionism?" I said, "Well, it's obvious. I mean, you have a job that's way too big to ever be done, difficult to break down into pieces and ever even get started on, and so it just feels totally overwhelming, so why even start?" He went, "Have you been reading my mail? Uh, Give me back my journal," because it was exactly the sort of thing that was going through his head. And the only reason I know it is because it's exactly what goes through my head all the time. So perfectionism. Oh, and I forgot to mention that really seems integral to workaholism is perfectionism. And some people go ahead and pursue perfection and try to get everything just so, and they work like dogs to get it to happen, and practically fall on their swords and all of this to get everything perfect. And others of us, myself included, we just see stuff that is impossible to do perfectly, and so why try? And so that's what I came in with a lot of, was underwork behaviors, a bent towards underwork. And I didn't know if they could help me, but they told me in no uncertain terms they could. They said underwork and overwork is two sides of the same coin. And I'm really glad, because I wouldn't have stuck, and I might be in a very, very bad way now. Which reminds me, let me just go ahead and get into my story, and you'll see why. So I came in, I'd been in one 12-step program before, and I had joined WA kind of on a lark. I knew I had a bit of a problem and was a little worried about it, and I always say I was just shoring up. I was hedging my bets. I said, well, I probably should do something about it. I'm not, and really, I didn't know it. I don't think I ever said it then, but really I was saying, I don't think I'm really like a work addict. I'm not, or if I am, I don't have it that bad, which is so easy, right? I come in, I'm working 55-hour weeks. The guy next to me is working 60. The gal next to him is working 65. It's easy to say, well, I got a problem, but not that big a problem. Because the other thing was, my story was, as soon as I'm done with this graduate program, I'm not going to work, anything like this. And I was worried about the underwork. I was worried I was going to get into my job, be burnt out, you know, eke out a crappy 35-hour week and end up getting fired for not doing enough. Which again, there comes that fear, perfectionism, which are real clear warning signals. Hey, Andrew, you got some workaholic thinking going on. And so I came in and wasn't. I went to meetings every week, but didn't get a sponsor. I wasn't working the steps. I was barely, if at all, reading the literature. I knew I really liked the feeling that I got in the meetings, and I really identified with these people, and they were carrying a message that I really enjoyed hearing. And to be honest, I don't know that it really occurred to me to do the real deal, sponsorship and step work. I think I had the idea, I'm in a program, I'm doing this steps, there you go. And then I got my job coming out of that graduate program, and it was a very rocky start from the very beginning, and I didn't like it, didn't want to be there, didn't want to be in the role I was in. I thought in terms of, I'm going to fulfill my 1-year obligation and then bolt, get the heck out of this team. I just came here for the money and to get into this really great company, and as soon as I can, I'm going to go anywhere else. And incidentally, I'll say it now rather than later, that itself could have been really terrible. That itself could have, say I was successful at what I wanted to do, get a real good first year down and really prove myself and just be stellar, and then go anywhere else. Well, anywhere else would have probably been a different company. And I've since found out that a lot of evidence that this company is one of the best in the world, and certainly the very best for me to be at. It's just a really so many different ways in which I could talk about what a great situation I have at this company, and I might have run blindly to something else. And I've seen a lot of people do it, non-workaholics, going, in exactly this way, wanting prestige, money, whatever, and they go somewhere else and they hate it and they come back here. So that could have been one consequence of my workaholism. And then the biggest one was, so I still felt obligated with a year. I had didn't have a mortgage, but I had a kid, and a very young kid, and I was and am the only income in our family, and I started to have pain, pretty intense pain in my fingers. And I forgot to mention, my job is it's all done at a computer. It's a long story. That they ended up having to get an official estimate of how much typing I was supposed to do, and it was that 95% of my job is typing, and I would say probably more than that, really. And so that was pretty scary. That was disconcerting, to say the least, for me and others here at my company. My output started to really tank. I was having to navigate tricky situations with, in particular with my boss, to say, hey, I'm not able to do that. And I was scared that I was going to mess up my fingers, my hands, and not be able to use them for other tasks. And that started to become true as that disease progressed. And I call it a disease. I mean, that ailment, that symptom, or that pain, we'll just call it that pain, started to progress. It did get to the point where I had trouble opening doorknobs, carrying groceries, picking up my daughter, turning on and off a faucet, really very simple stuff. Driving, one time it was a problem with driving. And it started to expand and move. The pain did. I forget where all I had pain. And I was trying all kinds of stuff. I had so many doctor's visits that uh, just the copays was getting to be a lot of money. And I had really, really good insurance through my company that helped with that. And it still was getting, just from the sheer number of things I was trying physical therapy, which racked up quite a few appointments. I went to a hand surgeon, and that was a wild ride. He was a little bit trigger happy trying to do carpal tunnel surgery, and I'm lucky that I was talking to a lot of people about what all was going on, and some of them knew people who had carpal tunnel surgery, and one lady had it and said she had more pain afterwards than before, um, and no particular benefit in terms of range of motion or usability of her hands. And so that kind of, again, very scary. And I found out that it was psychosomatic pain. Pain was real, but the source was not physical. It was not in, certainly not in the parts of my body that the medical experts were looking. And that's why when they stuck me with needles and shot electricity through my arm, they found that my nerves were textbook, was the word that they used. And when they did an x-ray, they found no structural problems whatsoever, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why all the things that they prescribed, all the painkillers and isn't that interesting that my pain didn't really respond to painkillers? That in retrospect seems obvious. When it's psychosomatic pain, the mind can just keep doing it, regardless of what pills I take. And that's why it could move. This pain would be here, and then I'd have pain somewhere else, or then I'd have a weird kind of nerve type symptom over here. And the thing that really kicked it was I had these symptoms that didn't make sense at all. It's like I started to learn a bit about the physiology of the hands, and I realized, oh, this symptom that I recently acquired isn't medically possible. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever, given the way that my hands are innervated. So, I say all of this because it actually is pretty similar to the program. The the fix that I found, we had a come to Jesus meeting where they said if you can't do the work, you're gonna get fired. And so basically, talk about rocking a hard place. I was looking at being fired and unemployable in the industry I'd just gotten trained in, and where all of my skill set was. I'm not exactly the kind of guy who can just switch over to, say, landscaping maintenance, and even then, the hand pain would have been an issue, and be a truck driver or what. I mean, there were very few things I could easily switch to out of industries that have the vast majority of your work, being at a computer. And even then, the hand pain would have been a issue. So I was scared shitless. Pardon my French. I was. That's not in the literature, by the way. And and that was part of what led me to try this crazy idea. They said that I found this thing on the internet that said maybe it's possible for your pain to be psychosomatic. We can't say. You might want to have a specialized certified person advise you whether that's likely for you. But if you've tried all this stuff, you might want to try this. And they said give all the other stuff up. And at that point, I think I had painkillers, exercise and stretching regimen that had been suggested by a PT. I had 2 diets that had been suggested by a osteopath. Yeah, all kinds of stuff. And they said give all that stuff up and start doing the activity that causes, that you think is causing you pain, which is really drastic, right? I was worried about screwing up my hands, but at this point, did it matter much whether my hands got screwed up or not? I mean, I was facing consequences anyways from not typing. So I tried it and started typing. It's kind of this leap of faith. That's one way that I see a parallel with the program, kind of a step two sort of thing. And certainly that meeting where they said you're going to get fired was very much a step one kind of feeling and experience. And all of a sudden I could type again. Minor miracle. It was a little tricky to explain to people. I wasn't a big fan of telling them that it was all in my head. At least that's how they would have heard it. Again, anybody out there suffering from psychosomaticism, I know what it's like, and I know that the pain is real. It's real. And the trick is we're looking in the wrong place. And yeah, that reminds me a bit of what we were talking about before, that I'm looking in the wrong place for my self-esteem with my work. I'm looking in the wrong place for someone to take care of me like a parent. My company is not going to take care of me. They did a really good job, by the way. I'm very, very grateful, and I see that very, very differently now than I did at the time, that they really did the right thing by me. And I shouldn't even be depending on a parent to be like a parent at my age, is what the big book says. So to realize that I was treating my boss and my company as a parental figure was sobering, was very eye-opening, and gave me pause for a lot of introspection. So that's how I got serious about WA, and I was in the program for half a year, and so I got a sponsor. And this was something I'd asked everybody I knew to ask, and he was the last one I asked, and he he was on sabbatical, so he had some time, some free time. I was really worried he was going to say no. I think he had said no to somebody just before me. Or maybe I'd asked him before. I think maybe he was the first one I asked, and he said no. And then later he was on sabbatical, and he said, okay, I'll sponsor you on a temporary basis, a strictly temporary basis, and definitely by the time I'm off of sabbatical, we're going to relook at this and see if it's working for both of us, because we're workaholics, I mean, it's practically like sponsoring somebody is a slip, right? Because you got to work with them. So we've been temporary sponsor and sponsee for several years now, and I've never reminded him of the fact that that this sponsor-sponsee relationship is a temporary one, because I need him too much. I can't afford to remind him of that. I'm hoping that after a few more years he'll just forget all about that part of it. And I'm on step 7 after several years. And I think that speaks to the difference between WA and other programs, that if I were an alcoholic and I were still on step 7, I might be dead, Not a particularly good idea for an alcoholic. but I'm not. This is WA, and so you could make a case that well, let me put it this way. This is a better way to say it. My meetings have a tendency to start late, and most interestingly, there's almost always, I'd say about half the time, usually it's my sponsor, somebody taking a nap in the middle of a meeting. And I feel like that is recovery from workaholism for an overworker, certainly. Probably for me, it ought to look a bit different as an underworker. Well, and there's the other thing. I had identified with underworking most when I came in, and for at least a year or two, if not more. And I really found proof of the idea in my own life and experience, my daily experience of workaholism, that over and underwork are two sides of the same coin. I tend to underwork when I'm burnt out and suffering the consequences of overwork, or overworking thinking, if that phrase makes any sense. And then the interesting other side of that is I tend to overwork when I've been underworking a lot, right? If I got a deadline and that really does need to be hit, or even like I've had times that I underworked right up until the deadline date, and then I scramble for several days after that and begging for more time and making excuses and bust my but to make it past a deadline. And and there gets to be a lot of fear in that. I mean, I'll just speak to that experience a bit. I've had it quite a few times. Is That's where a lot of fear comes up. I'm past deadline. I need to get it out the door, and I also don't want something to go horribly wrong with what I do, and have output that totally sucks and ends up with consequences accruing, because then I could get fired, right? So that can be a cause of a lot of overwork. It's basically what you call binging, you know, um, food bingers. Don't eat anything and then eat the entire fridge, everything inside and the fridge itself. I also go to well, anyway. So that's basically my story. And another thing that occurs to me about the basis in the big book for the idea of workaholism is it talks about it's easy to rest on our laurels, and we're in trouble if we do. For what we really have is a daily reprieve from addiction, from exaholism. And I've seen people sober long term with a really strong recovery. They've worked the steps, they're doing service, all kinds of stuff, and then they start to slack off. Not as many meetings, not as many phone calls. This is not. I'm not thinking particularly of WA here, although I think it's true. Yeah, I think I've seen it in WA too. It's a pretty forgiving addiction. Well, unless you have a story like mine, which is not a requirement. That is not. That's part of why I want to not focus too much on all the things that could be said about my story, is because that story alone that I gave of the psychosomatic pain and all of that could turn a lot of people away and say, oh well, if that's what workaholism is, because that isn't. That's what it was for me. That's what it looked like, you know, and that's what I needed to get serious about this. But read the stories in the back of the big book of AA, and you'll find all kinds of, there's 30 or 40 different types of alcoholic described back there, with very, very different stories, some of which are very, what do they call them, shallow bottom stories, where, it's just, no going to jail, no losing jobs, no flipping over cars, no nothing, but he didn't like what it was doing to him, and he was accruing consequences. He just had a very different story. That's all that means. So, yeah, I've seen people, fewer meetings, and then maybe not as much service that they're doing, or not returning calls, or the biggest one is I've seen people get really concerned with their jobs. And where's the line between working a lot and constantly talking to me when I do catch them on the phone about their job, and every time I see them in a meeting they're talking about stuff that happened at work and how their boss pissed them off this time. Where's the line between that and obsession? Where's the line between that and workaholism? And the big book has a lot to say about different classifications of what would you call it, of behavior. There's the addict, in their case the alcoholic, there's a particular definition, which, in program, our definition, that is not the same, and it's known not to be the same as what other people mean when they say alcoholic. The therapeutic definition, or whatever, you know what I mean, that definition is laid out, that way of understanding that word is laid out in that part of the big book. And it also talks about the heavy drinker, the hard drinker, the moderate drinker, and the same is true of working. There's plenty of people who are moderate workers. They work, they stop, that's it. And they might even sound like they have some symptoms, because we all get worked up about it. I mean, one reason for that is work almost invariably has something to do with other people. Even if I work at home, I work from home, I own my own business, I very rarely talk to anybody about any part of my work, but I hand off the product of it to a customer. So in some way, it's almost always got at least a little bit to do with other people. And all it takes is a little bit. I don't know about you guys, but I've found that interpersonal stuff is what really gets me crazy in a heartbeat. And when there's no other like, I might not even care about what exactly happened, but because it happened with so and so, and he said such and such. Oh man. So back to this idea that it's a dangerous and insidious. Yeah, come to think of it, we were talking about fear before, and isn't that what the 12 and 12, or maybe it's the Big Book says, that fear is an insidious and corroding thread throughout our lives. It ought to be classed with stealing. And so it's easy to not pay much attention to it, to not think that it's a real thing, and that be one way people can start doing what the Big Book cautions against, which is resting on your laurels. And then I've seen it go very poorly for people. I know for myself that if I'm not in recovery in WA, I'm that much more likely to have trouble with other addictions. And certainly I think I can say, yeah, without much qualification, that that workaholism was a switching of addictions for me. And they're all related. I mean, in some sense, it's numerous faces of the same issue, that I have addiction, and it so happens that that manifests here, here, and here. And so if I'm not careful about work, I can have other more pressing issues. And so I find that it's really, really great for me to have added another program that's specific to work, and that I can really identify with people and share openly, and they know instantly what I'm talking about. As soon as I start my sentence, they're like, oh yeah, oh, I know what that's like. And they'll be sharing about something that, to other people on the surface might seem totally different, but we both are really getting each other when we talk about those sorts of things. So the last thing I wanted to say on all that was workaholism is a problem anytime I'm doing a task. It's easy to think that it has to do with paid work, but it doesn't. That's what brought me in, but that's what got my attention and got me thinking I was probably a workaholic. But nowadays my thing has been with my family. It's been this unpaid work, where I work harder when I'm at home than when I'm at the office, and I find that I have even more workaholic issues there. I have a lot more workaholic thinking there. Gotta be super dad. And when I am not aware that that's the mode I'm operating in, is I have to be super dad, I end up being a shitty dad. I mean, it just goes to the very worst end of the spectrum. In terms of, because it breaks down. It's untenable, and it was not that hard to see that was not going to work on a long-term basis, to want to always be super dad. There's times to just be dad. There's times to kind of check out and say, I'm not available. And I've been doing a lot of that lately, because it became really clear. This is right after the holidays, and everything went great, and it was all felt very relaxing and stress-free. But in retrospect, there's something going on, some undercurrent, that I got really burnt out, and it doesn't have to make sense. I don't have to have a clear, here's why I'm burnt out. All I know is I am, and I can see the effects. I can see it as plain as day. I don't need to know exactly why and how. I just need to rest. And that was something that I wanted to talk about was that rest has been a really tricky concept for me. I thought rest was stuff like video games. Uh, I didn't realize that basically video game addiction is a subset of my workaholic addiction. And I've really struggled with that over the years because it's so easy to say, well, it's just video games. To poo-poo it as a real piece of business. That really, especially for me in my story and as an underworker, video games work. That I'm trying to acquire lots of stuff. I'm trying to do really well. I tend to be perfectionistic. I'm this one of these what do they call it, 100% completionist, or I forget what the word is for it, but people who try to do the whole, every aspect of the game, every piece of the puzzle um, has to be acquired, and just because it's not real doesn't, just tell that to my brain. I would love for, I would love to really understand that at depth. Um, in my heart, believe, oh yeah, this isn't real. It doesn't really matter. That's not what I see when I watch myself, interact with video games. And the same with video. Maybe people can identify more with that. Anybody who's been on YouTube can understand what a 12-step person means by the phenomenon of craving. When I have one, I want another, and that makes me want two more, and those make me want four more. And pretty soon I told myself I'm gonna, watch for 40 minutes, and it's, an hour and a half or whatever, and that would be a best case. That would seem to me like a heavy drinker kind of thing to do. An addict, the person in that furthest out, most extreme class, it could be the next day, right? So, rest is not this busyness and activity and frenzy. It's not work hard, play hard, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. Rest is, a lot of times for me, doing absolutely nothing. Like this here. I've had times that I was totally immersed in one or more 12-step programs. I was doing all this stuff like a weekend marathon or even a retreat, and felt burnt out and identified workaholism very clearly afterwards. I almost never see it coming ahead of time. If I did, this would be a very different talk. I would be a moderate worker, wouldn't I? And so a lot of times I have to force myself to do nothing, and I can stomach it for about 10 minutes. And sometimes laying down helps to just like do nothing. And sometimes even, I have a prayer and meditation practice in the spirit of the 11th step, and a lot of times I have to sit down and not even do that, because I remember one time a sponsee, I was telling him about Workaholics Anonymous, and he said, can you be workaholic about your step work? And I said, no, don't be ridiculous. Step work is good for you. Well, so is work. And incidentally, I think humans have a fundamental drive to work, to be useful and productive, and that is something that we value and need as a part of normal life. It's just I don't do it the way, normal people do. And I have a very hard time even approximating the way that normal people incorporate that as a healthy piece and big piece of their lives. You think about, we're all giving 40 hours a week anyway, and certainly in previous centuries it was a lot more. So back to this idea of rest. One of the best ways I ever heard it was somebody said, an old timer said, rest is when the mind can get off of what it was doing and on to something else. And take video games as an example. That's not rest, because for one thing, it's a frenzy of activity. If you watch me, you'll see that. And also, it's very, very difficult for the mind to get off of that. Once I'm done with that, I tend to have a lot of obsession about it. And that could even look like, for some people, an obsession not to do it. I know that's true of me. There's a major binging process or syndrome around that binge and purge, and so compulsively not doing it is also not particularly helpful. It certainly doesn't qualify as rest, the mind getting off of what it was doing and on to something else. And rest has been really, really important. It's in the WA literature. I don't know how heavily it's featured. Well, yeah, no. In the back, there's a whole page all about what it means and the benefits of it. Yeah, it's all over there. And that has been really, really important to me, to take breaks. And again, the last few years, I've struggled with workaholism more at home with my children than anywhere, by far. And so, for me, what it's looked like is every 2 hours, I take a break. It's pretty regular. It's pretty. I do it pretty much religiously. Every 2 hours, I've got a timer on my phone. That the hardest part of this is remembering to set that timer. And some people are able to go by the clock. I have a hard time remembering, much less sticking to what I see on the clock. But however it works is 10-minute break every 2 hours. I leave the situation. I walk out of the house, away from the people that I was interacting with and doing things for, taking requests from. In the case of my young children, it tends to be different types of play, that usually pretty high energy and intensely interactive. And I literally walk away. I go outside, which means I'm in a place that's very, very quiet. I don't do much of anything. And that has been life-changing. So some other things from the tools and principles that it talks about in the WA Book of Recovery, the kind of rainbow-colored yellow background book, which I've always wondered. I mean, you think about the Big Book of AA, they call it, some people call it the Blue Book. Every once in a while you'll hear it called the Blue Book, because that's usually the cover nowadays is colored. But what do we call that? our WA Book of Recovery, the Rainbow Book, the Yellow Book, I don't know. But anyway, it's got this section called Tools of Recovery and I think Principles of Recovery right next to each other, and they're phenomenal. I mean, it's huge. You could spend hours talking about that, which might be dangerous for a workaholic, either listening or doing the talking. But anyway, those are really things I really benefit from basing my life on, and my sponsors very, very often reminded me of them. I'll call him up about something, and it seems like he's coming out of left field. He'll say, well, what are you going to substitute? I might be talking about something that I'm thinking about doing, and I'm just thinking about the relative merits of the thing itself, and I might have an agenda of really, really hoping he'll say, yeah, go ahead and do it, Andrew. And what he says instead is, what are you going to substitute? And then, dang it, I have to actually think, and more importantly, I have to think in terms of recovery. Okay, what am I going to substitute? What am I willing to not do in place of this? Because it's a principle. It's literally a principle of the program. Which, I mean, it's worth a tiny tangent there. The 12-step of all 12-step groups says, with, one word different maybe, or omitted in some cases, says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message and practice these principles in all our affairs. And for me, usually, all of my affairs is pretty well covered by at home, at work, and out in public, on the streets and wherever all, in the, shops and malls and such. Pretty well covers it, right? But what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to practice these principles. So that means that honesty, being one of the principles of a 12-step program that's talked about a lot in the literature of every program, particularly AA, actually practice it. And, I mean, which pretty simple means I have to do it. I have to consciously make the choice to say honest things instead of dishonest things, which I don't know about you guys, but kind of comes up a few times at work, like a few times a day. And I remember a really great speaker tape that I heard one time. He said, well, yeah, of course I want to be honest. It's just that, in my business, I might want to frame the truth certain ways. I might want to add some perspective for the person that I'm telling the truth to, so that they'll understand better, and they might be, more likely to go a certain way, my way, really, because this could really affect my bottom line. And maybe some of you have heard this tape, but it's a hilarious way to treat the idea of practicing the principles in the sixth and seventh steps. That intellectually, of course, we're all on board with total honesty. We think of it in terms of 100%, but then rubber meets the road. Well, I mean, does this really count? I mean, I was just, I told half of the truth. Not my fault if he, misinterprets the other half, right? So I have to really practice it because, as you can tell from the way I'm sharing, got some pretty good skill with how to be honestly dishonest. And just laughing at myself here. So I have to actually practice it, and it's just like lifting weights. It's just like practicing a sport. I lift this honesty barbell until I get stronger with it. Until it gets easier to lift. And the same with other things. Humility, which is highly relevant to workaholics. We're used to being praised for our addiction. You take somebody addicted to some narcotic drug, and he tells whoever that's true of him. He says, "I'm an addict," and a lot of times, where does it come up? When he wants to tell you that he's been clean and sober for 3 years, and you say, "Well, that's nice. I'm not going to make you the treasurer of my nonprofit, or put you on the board of my company." It seems like such a big deal to addicts when we're not doing the addictive substance or process, but we don't. I'm saying so many addictions, you don't get a slap on the back for when people find out that that's what you are. But with workaholism, at least when you're not telling them that you're in Workaholics Anonymous, you're sure getting a lot of slaps on the back for that. John really goes above and beyond. He's just a real solid worker and just an all-around great guy. Love having him on the team. He's having some family problems lately, though, and it's been, I've noticed that he's been a little distracted by all that from his work, but we get paid more for workaholism. But here's the thing: the wage is not good. When you calculate what we're getting divided by what we're giving, it works out to be chump change. We're getting a crap deal, and we're doing it to ourselves. Nobody can actually make us work those hours. Nobody can actually make us fall on our sword every day. That's in our thinking. That's in our approach. Think about it. What principles am I practicing in all my affairs? I might be practicing dishonesty actively and consciously. I might be actively practicing pridefulness, I should say. Open-mindedness, I don't know about you guys, I had no experience of that. I was actively practicing close-mindedness for a long, long time. So, those are principles too. They're just ones that really hurt, that really do not benefit me. They seem to, that's why I practiced them, but turns out it's better when I do these. And one of the ones that I really want to highlight as one to practice is humor. It's in the tools and principles of WA, and I have never seen that before anywhere. Although in the big book it talks about we absolutely insist on enjoying life. We are not a glum lot. If newcomers could see no joy in what we do, they wouldn't want it. And there's also some in the early part of A Vision for You, and for some reason the direct quote is escaping me, but over and over it does talk about it, at least indirectly, just like it indirectly talks about surrender without actually using that word. At least in the first 164 pages, and I think it only comes up twice in the stories, but it talks so eloquently about surrender and ceased fighting, and by this time sanity rule had returned and all that sort of thing, but just to an overt practice of humor. I love it. I mean, that is, here's what I forget if he's my grand sponsor in WA, I don't think he is, but he's an old timer, and he says, my disease is always serious. We have an addictive disease, and I can't speak for anybody else, but that is a clear part of my thinking in my mind, is this, some programs they call it the addict, and it's this voice. There's no other way to say it. There's this voice that talks about you're not good enough, you need to work harder, something awful is going to happen, you don't deserve to be here, and now they know it, or they will soon, and then are you going to be in for it? They're going to drop you like a hot potato, da-da-da-da-da, which is, the thoughts that drive my workaholism. It doesn't necessarily always say, you got to work harder, although it might. It might get me with something even more to the core of these less than messages, these you are lacking in some way messages, that the natural response is to work really hard and try to cover that up, because that's all it really can do. Say I am lacking, I'm not good enough, and other people are just inherently better somehow. What am I going to do about that? I just get a new Andrew, like Andrew 2.0, and now I'm okay. What am I going to do about that? One way that some people say that is you can't take it with you when you die. I can be so successful, but then I retire, and I might feel a major existential angst about that. What am I now that I'm not a whatever? Now that I'm not a doctor or whatever, because that was my identity. That was where I got my self-worth. But anyway, back to humor, because this topic is humorless. Is that my disease is always serious, and the consequences are serious. What I hear in my head is serious. It's always, a lot of times it's a fear-based message that's very, it's never funny. But the truth is, when I look at myself more objectively, when I take a few steps back, it's ridiculous. This stuff that goes through my head is hilarious, and the impotence of it can be a source of humor, and I actively practice humor. I try. My meetings are very. There's a lot of laughter. It's a very fun place to be. We're very making a lot of funny comments. We're having a lot of fun at the expense of our thinking, by showing off how crazy our thinking is, and it's hard to really express. I mean, it's such a big part of my life that it really, here's the way to say it. I would not be recognizable as a person if I went back to, even just on this issue of humor, this idea of practicing humor, if I went back to the way that I was before. My sponsor puts it this way. He says, Andrew, you were born to have this sick sense of humor, and it just makes me smile from ear to ear. I mean, if I weren't, the other way I put it is, if I weren't laughing, I'd be crying. Those are really my options as an addict. And that's pretty much all I got. So